My foster son called the police on his own parents at Thanksgiving, and he was absolutely right to do it. I was carving the turkey when I heard my foster son Callum's voice from the dining room saying he needed to make a phone call. Something in his tone made me look up from the bird, and that's when I saw him standing in the doorway with our landline in his hand, his face completely white. He was 11 years old and shaking so badly the phone was rattling against his ear. My sister Diane lunged across the table trying to grab it from him, but Callum stepped back and said into the receiver that he needed police and an ambulance at our address. His biological parents were here and someone was hurt badly. Diane screamed that he was lying and making things up for attention, but I could see blood dripping from somewhere onto our hardwood floor. I dropped the carving knife and ran into the dining room where my brother-in-law Kirk was bent over someone on the floor near the china cabinet. The person on the floor was Callum's biological mother, Margot, and she wasn't moving. There was blood pooling under her head and spreading across the cream-colored rug my grandmother had given us. Kirk had his hands on her neck like he was checking for a pulse, and his shirt was covered in red. Callum's biological father, Warren, was standing against the wall with both hands up like he was surrendering, and his face had this expression I'd never seen on another human being before. Pure terror mixed with something that looked like relief. My husband Jeffrey came running from the kitchen where he'd been making gravy, and he stopped dead when he saw the scene. Diane kept yelling that this was a misunderstanding and we needed to hang up before police arrived, that we could handle this as a family. But Callum just stood there with the phone pressed to his ear, giving the dispatcher our address again and describing what he was seeing. His voice stayed remarkably steady for a kid who'd just called 911 on his own parents. I'd been Callum's foster mother for 8 months after he was removed from Warren and Margot's custody. The case file said neglect and educational neglect, which were the official terms for parents who left their kid alone for days at a time and never enrolled him in school. Callum had been living with us since March, and this was supposed to be his first supervised visit with his biological parents since the removal. The caseworker had approved a Thanksgiving dinner at our house with strict supervision, meaning Jeffrey and I had to be present the entire time. Warren and Margot had arrived at 2 p.m. acting nervous but appropriate, bringing a store-bought pie and apologizing for everything that had happened. They'd seemed genuinely remorseful about their past mistakes, talking about the parenting classes they were taking and the stable housing they'd finally secured. Diane had invited herself to Thanksgiving when she heard Callum's bio parents would be there, saying she wanted to observe how they interacted with him. She'd always been suspicious of the foster system and thought kids belonged with their biological families no matter what. The blood kept spreading across the rug while we waited for sirens. Kirk finally looked up from Margot and said she was breathing but unconscious, and we needed to keep pressure on the head wound. Jeffrey grabbed dish towels from the kitchen and handed them to Kirk, who pressed them against the back of Margot's skull. Warren hadn't moved from his position against the wall, and he was crying now, these horrible gasping sobs that made my stomach hurt. Callum set the phone down after the dispatcher said units were coming, and he came to stand next to me. His whole body was trembling, and I put my arm around his shoulders and pulled him close. Diane was still insisting we could fix this before police arrived, that calling 911 was an overreaction that would destroy this family's chance at reunification. She kept saying Margot probably just slipped and hit her head, that accidents happen and we didn't need law enforcement involved in family business. That's when Callum spoke up in a voice louder than I'd ever heard him use. He said Margot didn't slip, that Warren had shoved her backwards into the china cabinet during an argument, and her head had hit the corner of the marble shelf. Everyone went completely silent. Warren slid down the wall until he was sitting on the floor with his head in his hands. Diane's face went red and she started to say something, but Callum kept talking. He said Warren and Margot had been fighting quietly in the hallway for 10 minutes before it got physical, arguing about money and drugs and whether they should leave before dessert. Margot had said something about Warren using a gun, and that's when he'd pushed her. Callum had seen the whole thing from where he'd been sitting on the stairs, and he'd run to call 911 the second Margot hit the floor. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, because this meant everything was about to get so much worse than I'd thought. Sirens started getting louder from down the street, and Diane made one more attempt to convince us this was all a mistake. She said Warren was probably just trying to steady himself and accidentally bumped into Margot, that we were making this into something it wasn't. But I'd seen Warren's face when Callum described what happened, and there was no denial there. Just guilt and shame, and the knowledge that he'd destroyed whatever chance he had at getting his son back. The sirens got loud enough that our windows were vibrating, and then car doors were slamming outside. Jeffrey went to unlock the front door while I stayed with Callum, whose shaking had gotten worse. He whispered to me that he was sorry for ruining Thanksgiving, and I told him he had absolutely nothing to apologize for. He'd done exactly the right thing by calling for help, and I was proud of him for being so brave. 3 officers came through the door with their hands near their weapons, and the lead cop was a tall black woman whose badge said Lieutenant Rashida Mills. She took one look at the blood and Margot on the floor and immediately called for the paramedics who were still outside. 2 EMTs rushed in with their bags and equipment, pushing past everyone to get to Margot. They started checking her vitals and asking Kirk what happened, and he explained about the head wound and how long she'd been unconscious. One EMT was shining a light in Margot's eyes while the other was taking her blood pressure, and their faces looked worried in a way that made my stomach drop. Lieutenant Mills separated everyone into different rooms for statements. She put Warren in the living room with one officer, Diane in the kitchen with another, and asked Callum if he'd be willing to talk to her in the den. Callum nodded and looked at me, and Mills said I could stay with him since I was his legal guardian. The den was our smallest room with just a desk and 2 chairs, and Mills pulled up a 3rd chair so we could all sit in a circle. She pulled out a small notebook and asked Callum to tell her what he saw, starting from when Warren and Margot arrived. Callum's voice was shaking at first, but he managed to explain about them showing up with the pie and acting normal during dinner. He He said everything seemed fine until after we'd eaten, when Warren and Margot had gone into the hallway to talk privately. Callum had been sitting on the stairs playing a game on his tablet when he heard their voices getting louder. Mills asked what they were arguing about, and Callum said money at first, then something about Warren promising to stay clean but obviously using again. Margot had said she could tell because his pupils were wrong and he was sweating too much. That's when Warren had told her to shut up, and she'd said she was done covering for him. Callum demonstrated how Warren had put both hands on Margot's shoulders and shoved her backwards into the china cabinet. She'd hit the marble shelf with the back of her head and gone down immediately. Mills wrote everything down without showing any emotion on her face, but I could see her jaw getting tighter with each detail. She asked Callum if Warren had tried to help Margot after she fell, and Callum said no. Warren had just stood there staring at her for maybe 10 seconds before Kirk had run over from the dining room. Mills asked if anyone else had seen the shove besides Callum, and he said he didn't think so because everyone else had been in the dining room or kitchen. She asked if Warren had said anything after Margot hit the floor, and Callum said yes. Warren had whispered, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to," over and over, but he hadn't tried to check if she was okay. Mills thanked Callum for being so detailed and honest, then asked if Warren had ever hurt him or Margot before. Callum looked at me and then back at Mills before saying yes, but not like this. Warren had grabbed him hard enough to leave bruises a few times and had broken Margot's phone once by throwing it at the wall, but he'd never seen Warren actually knock someone unconscious before. That information hit me like a punch to the chest because it wasn't in any of the case files I'd read. The removal had been for neglect, not physical abuse, which meant either the caseworker hadn't known about the violence or it hadn't been reported. Mills saw my face and asked Callum if he'd told anyone about Warren hurting him, and Callum shook his head. He said he'd learned early that telling adults about bad stuff happening at home just made things worse because Warren would get mad and Margot would cry and then they'd both ignore him for days. It was easier to just keep quiet and try to stay out of the way. Mills closed her notebook and told Callum he'd done an incredibly brave thing by calling 911 today, that speaking up probably saved Margot's life. She said sometimes the right thing is also the hardest thing, and she was impressed by how mature he'd been during a scary situation. Callum started crying then, these quiet tears that rolled down his face while he tried not to make any noise. I pulled him against my side and let him cry while Mills stepped out to give us privacy. The EMTs were loading Margot onto a stretcher when we came back to the dining room. She still wasn't conscious, and they had an oxygen mask over her face and an IV line going into her arm. One of them was saying something about possible skull fracture and subdural hematoma, medical terms that sounded terrifying even though I didn't fully understand them. They wheeled her out to the ambulance with Kirk following behind to give them more information. Warren tried to stand up and go with them, but the officer in the living room told him he needed to stay put. Warren started yelling that Margot was his wife and he had a right to be with her at the hospital, but Mills came out and explained calmly that he was being detained for questioning and wouldn't be going anywhere right now. His face crumpled and he sank back down onto our couch, putting his head in his hands. Mills pulled me aside in the hallway and asked if I'd noticed anything unusual about Warren's behavior today. I told her honestly that he'd seemed nervous and sweaty, but I'd attributed that to anxiety about the supervised visit. She asked if I'd seen him use the bathroom multiple times or disappear for extended periods, and I realized he had. He'd gone to the bathroom 3 times in the first hour, and each time he'd been gone for at least 10 minutes. Mills nodded like this confirmed something she was thinking, then asked if I'd be willing to let them search the bathroom Warren had been using. I said yes immediately and showed her to the powder room off the kitchen. She pulled on gloves and started checking the trash can and the area around the toilet. Within 2 minutes, she'd found a small plastic baggie with white powder residue tucked behind the tank. She photographed it carefully and sealed it in an evidence bag, then called for one of the other officers to come document the find. Jeffrey had been standing in the kitchen doorway watching everything, and his face looked gray. He asked me quietly what was happening, and I explained that Warren had apparently been using drugs in our bathroom while we were hosting a supervised visit. Jeffrey's expression went from shocked to furious in about 2 seconds. He said Warren had brought drugs into our house where Callum lived, where we'd been trying to provide a safe and stable environment for a kid who'd already been through hell. His voice got louder as he worked through the implications, and Mills had to ask him to keep it down because they were still conducting interviews. Jeffrey apologized but kept muttering about the absolute audacity of bringing controlled substances to a foster home during a court-approved visit. I was angry too. But more than that, I was sad. Sad that Warren and Margot had been lying about getting clean, sad that their chance at reunification had just evaporated, and sad that Callum would have to process another betrayal from the people who were supposed to protect him. Diane was still in the kitchen being interviewed by the second officer, and I could hear her insisting that this was all blown out of proportion. She was saying that families should stick together during hard times, not call police on each other. The officer was asking her what she'd witnessed, and Diane admitted she'd been in the dining room when Margot fell and hadn't actually seen the shove, but she maintained that Warren wasn't a violent person, and there must be some other explanation. The officer asked if she'd seen the drugs that were found, and Diane's voice got defensive. She said people make mistakes, and Warren was obviously struggling with addiction, but that didn't make him a bad person who deserved to be arrested. The officer's response was calm, but firm, explaining that assault was assault regardless of the attacker's personal struggles, and bringing illegal drugs into a home with a minor was a separate, serious offense. Diane's voice got higher as she argued that the system was too quick to criminalize people who needed help, not punishment. I wanted to go in there and tell her that Warren had already received help through multiple intervention programs according to his case file, and he'd chosen to use again anyway. But I stayed with Callum instead because he was more important than winning an argument with my sister. Mills came back and asked if Callum would be okay talking to someone from Child Protective Services who was on the way. She explained that CPS needed to document everything for Callum's case file and to determine what would happen with the reunification plan. Callum asked if this meant he couldn't go back to Warren and Margot, and Mills said that decision would be up to the court, but today's events would definitely be considered. Callum's face did something complicated, cycling through relief and guilt and sadness all at once. He said he loved his parents and wanted them to get better, but he was also scared of Warren when he got like this. Mills knelt down so she was at Callum's eye level and told him those feelings were completely normal and okay. She said loving someone and being scared of them could both be true at the same time, and having complicated feelings about his parents didn't make him bad or disloyal. Callum nodded but didn't say anything else, just pressed closer to my side. Warren was handcuffed and led out to a patrol car about 20 minutes later. Mills explained to him that he was being arrested for assault and possession of a controlled substance, and he had the right to remain silent and the right to an attorney. Warren didn't fight or argue, just let them put him in the back of the cruiser with his head down. Diane ran out onto the front lawn yelling that this was wrong, that Warren needed rehab, not jail, that the system was failing people who were trying their best. Mills turned to her and said gently but firmly that Warren had physically harmed someone badly enough to require hospitalization, and had brought illegal drugs into a home with a vulnerable child. Those actions had consequences regardless of his addiction struggles. Diane looked at me like I should back her up, but I just shook my head. I wasn't going to defend someone who'd assaulted his wife in my house and risked Callum's placement by bringing drugs into our home. The CPS caseworker arrived just as the patrol car was pulling away. Her name was Felicity Kovach, and she had kind eyes and a no-nonsense way of talking that I immediately liked. She sat down with Callum and me in the den and asked him to walk her through the whole day one more time. Callum was getting tired of repeating the story, but he did it anyway, adding more details about how Warren had been acting strange all afternoon. He mentioned that Warren had been really fidgety during dinner, bouncing his leg under the table and barely eating anything. Margot had seemed stressed too, shooting Warren looks that Callum described as worried and angry at the same time. Felicity took notes and asked Callum how he felt about having his bio parents at Thanksgiving, and he said honestly that he'd been nervous. He'd been with them at a few supervised visits at the CPS office, and they'd always seemed like they were performing, acting like perfect parents instead of being real. Today had felt the same way until they'd gone into the hallway and dropped the act. Felicity asked me how the placement had been going overall, and I told her the truth. Callum had been doing well with us, adjusting to school and making friends and seeming more confident each month. We'd had some behavioral issues in the first few weeks, testing boundaries and having meltdowns over small things, but that had settled down. He was in therapy once a week working through attachment issues and processing the neglect he'd experienced. His therapist had noted in her reports that Callum showed signs of hypervigilance and had difficulty trusting adults, which made sense given his history. But he'd been making progress, and Jeffrey and I had been talking about converting the foster placement to adoption if reunification didn't work out. Felicity's face softened when I said that, and she asked Callum how he felt about the possibility of staying with us permanently. Callum looked up at me and then at her and said quietly that he'd like that, if it was okay. He said living with us felt safe in a way his bio parents' house never had, and he didn't have to worry about whether there'd be food, or if adults would be home, or if someone would get hurt. That statement broke my heart into about 1,000 pieces, because no 11-year-old should have to worry about those things. Felicity must have felt the same way, because her eyes got shiny before she blinked and refocused. She explained that today's incident would almost certainly result in the termination of Warren and Margot's reunification plan. The assault combined with the drug possession and the new information about prior physical abuse created an unsafe situation that the court wouldn't ignore. She said there would be more hearings and evaluations, but Callum should prepare himself for the possibility that he wouldn't be going back to his biological parents. She asked if he understood what that meant, and Callum nodded. He said it meant they'd lose their chance to be his parents again, and he'd probably get adopted by someone else. His voice was matter of fact, but his eyes were wet. Felicity told him it was okay to feel sad about that, even if he was also relieved to be safe, that grief and relief could exist together. The hospital called while Felicity was still there to say Margot was awake and stable. She had a concussion and needed stitches for the head wound, but the CT scan showed no skull fracture or brain bleeding. She'd been incredibly lucky that the impact hadn't been a few inches different, or she might not have woken up at all. The doctor asked if there was someone who could come sit with her since Warren had been arrested, and she was asking for family. Jeffrey volunteered to go, which surprised me because he'd been furious about the whole situation, but he said someone should be there to make sure she was okay, and to get her side of the story. I stayed home with Callum while Felicity finished her paperwork and documented everything for the court. She took photos of our house where the assault happened and requested copies of the police report and medical records. She promised to keep us updated about what would happen next with the case. After everyone left, Callum and I sat on the couch in the living room surrounded by the ruins of Thanksgiving. The turkey was cold on the counter, dishes were abandoned everywhere, and there was still a faint blood smell in the dining room despite Kirk's attempts to clean the rug. Callum asked if I was mad at him for calling the police, and I told him absolutely not. I explained that calling 911 when someone is hurt is always the right choice, and he'd potentially saved Margot's life by getting help quickly. He'd shown incredible bravery and good judgment in a situation that would have overwhelmed most adults. He asked what would happen to Warren, and I said honestly that I didn't know for sure. Warren would probably face criminal charges for assault and drug possession, and those could result in jail time depending on his record and the prosecutor's decisions. Callum was quiet for a long time before saying he didn't want Warren to go to jail. He just wanted Warren to get help and stop hurting people. I told him those feelings made sense, and wanting someone to get better didn't mean they shouldn't face consequences for their actions. Jeffrey came back from the hospital around 10 p.m. looking exhausted. He said Margot had been crying on and off since she woke up, devastated about what happened and terrified about losing Callum permanently. She'd admitted to the doctor that Warren had relapsed about 6 weeks ago, but she'd been covering for him because she was scared CPS would find out and terminate their case. She'd known he was using again today, but had come to Thanksgiving anyway because missing the visit would have looked suspicious. Jeffrey had stayed while a police officer interviewed Margot about the assault, and she'd confirmed Callum's version of events exactly. Warren had pushed her deliberately during an argument, and she'd hit her head on the china cabinet. She said Warren had a pattern of getting physical when he was high and defensive, usually pushing or grabbing, but never this violent before. She'd been planning to leave him after they got Callum back, thinking she could keep everyone safe for just a few more months. Now she realized how stupid that plan had been. The guilt I felt hearing that was crushing. Margot had been trying to protect her reunification case by hiding Warren's relapse, and instead she'd put herself and Callum in danger. The system was supposed to help families stay together safely, but the pressure to appear perfect had made Margot lie about a serious problem. I wondered how many other parents were doing the same thing, covering up relapses and violence and instability because admitting problems meant losing their kids forever. It was an impossible position with no good choices. Jeffrey must have seen my face because he came over and put his arm around me. He said we couldn't fix the whole broken system, but we could make sure Callum was safe and supported. That was our job right now, and we were doing it. I nodded but couldn't shake the feeling that there had to be a better way to handle these situations. The days after Thanksgiving were a blur of phone calls and meetings. Felicity came back to do a full home evaluation since we were moving toward adoption. She checked our bedrooms and kitchen and asked detailed questions about our finances and backgrounds and parenting philosophy. She interviewed Callum separately about how he felt living with us, whether he felt safe and cared for, and whether he wanted to be adopted by us. He told her yes to everything, that he wanted to stay with us permanently, and didn't want to keep wondering if he'd have to leave. Felicity smiled at that and said she'd be recommending the court approve our adoption petition when the time came. The reunification case with Warren and Margot would need to be officially terminated first, but that process was moving forward rapidly given the assault and the drug possession. Warren's arraignment was scheduled for the Monday after Thanksgiving. I didn't attend, but I read the court documents later. He'd been charged with assault causing bodily injury, possession of cocaine, and child endangerment for bringing drugs into a home with a minor. His public defender entered a not guilty plea, but the evidence was overwhelming. The police had Warren's own words from that night about not meaning to hurt her. They had Callum's eyewitness testimony, they had Margot's confirmation of the assault, and they had the drugs found in our bathroom. The prosecutor was offering a plea deal that would involve prison time plus mandatory drug treatment, but Warren hadn't decided whether to accept it yet. Diane had called me 6 times trying to convince me to ask the prosecutor to drop the charges, saying Warren was sick and needed help, not punishment. I'd stopped answering her calls after the 3rd one. Callum's therapy sessions intensified in the weeks following Thanksgiving. His therapist, Dr. Monica Sheffield, said he was processing a lot of complicated grief about losing his biological parents permanently. He was also dealing with guilt about being the one who called the police, even though everyone kept telling him he'd done the right thing. Dr. Sheffield explained that kids in foster care often struggle with divided loyalties, feeling like they're betraying their bio parents by bonding with foster parents or by reporting abuse. Callum was showing signs of that internal conflict, talking about how much he loved Warren and Margot despite everything they'd done wrong. She said those feelings were healthy and normal, and our job was to validate them while still maintaining appropriate boundaries. Jeffrey and I started attending family therapy sessions with Callum to work on attachment and communication. Dr. Sheffield taught us strategies for helping Callum feel secure while acknowledging his loss. The court hearing for reunification termination happened 3 weeks after Thanksgiving. Callum didn't have to attend since he'd already given statements to CPS and police, but Jeffrey and I were there as his foster parents. Warren appeared via video from jail, looking thin and tired. Margot was there in person with a victim advocate, and she'd filed for divorce the week before. The judge reviewed all the evidence, including the assault, the drugs, the prior unreported physical abuse, and Warren's relapse. She asked Margot if she felt she could provide a safe home for Callum on her own, and Margot cried while admitting she couldn't. She said she'd been enabling Warren's addiction and making excuses for his behavior for years, and she needed to work on herself before she could be anyone's mother. The judge looked sad but unsurprised as she terminated both parents' rights and cleared the way for adoption. Warren tried to argue that he deserved another chance, but the judge cut him off. She said he'd already had multiple chances through the original case plan, and he'd violated that trust by using drugs and assaulting his wife in front of his child. The decision was final. Callum took the news better than I'd expected. He cried for about an hour when we told him, but then he asked when the adoption would be official. I explained we'd need to file the petition and wait for another court date, probably a few months. He asked if that meant he was really ours forever after that, and Jeffrey said yes. That's exactly what it meant. Callum smiled through his tears and said good, because he was tired of not knowing where he belonged. That night at dinner, he asked if he could start calling us mom and dad instead of by our first names, and I absolutely lost it. I'd been holding myself together through all the stress and legal proceedings, but that question broke me open. I told him yes, of course he could. We'd be honored. Jeffrey was crying too, and we all just sat there in our kitchen being a mess together. It was the best moment of what had been an incredibly hard few weeks. The adoption was finalized in March, 5 months after the Thanksgiving incident. The courtroom was full of people who'd supported us through the process. Felicity, Dr. Sheffield, our friends, some teachers from Callum's school. Even Lieutenant Mills showed up in her uniform to watch. Diane hadn't come, still convinced I'd stolen her nephew by not supporting Warren's reunification. I'd stopped trying to maintain that relationship after she'd sent me a long email about how foster parents were destroying families by making kids comfortable in their homes. The judge who finalized the adoption was different from the one who terminated Warren and Margot's rights. A younger woman named Judge Patricia Nguyen, who smiled at Callum when he came forward. She asked him some questions about whether he understood what adoption meant and whether he wanted Jeffrey and me to be his legal parents. Callum answered clearly that yes, he understood, and yes, he wanted this. Judge Nguyen signed the papers and congratulated us, saying she was proud of Callum for being so brave during a difficult time. After the adoption, we went out for ice cream and then home to a small party with close friends. Callum was exhausted but happy, showing everyone his adoption certificate and new birth certificate with our names listed as his parents. Someone asked him how it felt to finally have a permanent family, and he said it felt like he could stop waiting for bad things to happen. That answer gutted every adult in the room. One of Jeffrey's colleagues asked Callum if he ever regretted calling the police on Thanksgiving, and Callum thought about it seriously before answering. He said sometimes he felt bad that Warren went to jail and Margot lost custody, but he didn't regret making sure Margot got help when she was hurt. He said if he hadn't called, maybe nobody would have known how bad things really were, and he might have ended up going back to a dangerous situation. The colleague nodded and told Callum he'd shown incredible maturity and courage. Warren ended up taking the plea deal and got 3 years in prison plus mandatory treatment after release. Margot moved to a different state to live with her sister and start over. She sent Callum a letter through CPS asking for his forgiveness and saying she hoped he had a good life with his new family. Callum read it multiple times and eventually wrote back saying he forgave her and hoped she got better. We put that letter in his memory box along with the few photos and items he'd had from his biological family. Dr. Sheffield said maintaining some connection to his past was healthy as long as it didn't interfere with his current stability. Callum occasionally asked about Warren and Margot, wondering if they were okay, and we'd tell him what little information we had. The curiosity was natural and didn't mean he wanted to go back to them. 2 years after the adoption, Callum came home from school and told us he'd had to do a presentation about a time he showed courage. He'd talked about calling 911 on Thanksgiving and why it was the right thing to do even though it was scary. His teacher had apparently been moved to tears, and several classmates had said he was brave. One kid whose father was a police officer had said Callum probably saved his biological mom's life by getting help so fast. Callum had felt proud instead of guilty for the first time when talking about that day. I asked him what changed, and he said his school counselor had helped him understand that protecting someone from danger was an act of love, not betrayal. Calling the police had been a way of trying to keep both Margot and himself safe, even if it had meant his biological parents lost custody. Now Callum is 15 and doing well. He's on the soccer team and gets mostly B's and has friends who come over to play video games. He still sees Dr. Sheffield monthly to work through adoption and trauma issues, but the appointments are more maintenance than crisis management. He talks about Warren and Margot sometimes, usually wondering if they ever think about him, or if they got the help they needed. I'm always honest with him, saying I don't know, but I hope they're doing better. He's expressed interest in possibly reaching out to Margot when he's 18, and Jeffrey and I have said that's his choice to make when he's ready. We've made it clear we're not threatened by his curiosity about his biological family or his complicated feelings about them. They're part of his story, even if they're not part of his daily life anymore. Appreciate you watching this far. If you enjoyed it, drop a like, leave a comment, and subscribe so you won't miss the next story.